More than 3 years after the release of Quantum Break, critically acclaimed studio Remedy Entertainment returns with another powered-up narrative shooter, but this time with shades of Metroidvania, for the paranormal experience of Control. Just like Remedy has experimented to improve their narrative quality game after game, so have they tried to push the border in terms of rendering techniques and graphical fidelity. But what does that mean in terms of performance for people who don't have the latest or greatest graphical cards? What can you expect from a last generation GPU? Can you still play the game comfortably? Let's take a look at a series of test scenarios. Regrettably, at the moment, it seems that a bug prevents Control from starting on integrated Intel HD GPUs. I tried the game on two laptops, a Mi Notebook Pro with an i5 quad-core CPU configured to use its integrated UHD graphics and 8GB of RAM, and a Dell XPS 13 from 2017 with an Intel Core i7, Intel UHD graphics and 8GB of RAM. On both cases, the game will not boot into the menu using the latest driver, but will crash back to the desktop when trying to load any game chapter at any setting. The Ryzen 5 3400G APU comes paired with the Vega 11 integrated GPU, which boasts the title of being the most powerful integrated GPU currently available. I pair it with 8GB of 3000 MHz dual-channel DDR4 RAM for this test, as well as the auto overclock feature enabled for the GPU. Control is a very GPU-intensive game, even while static, and its combat tends to get flashy, with a large number of particle, effects, and environmental elements breaking into pieces. The game uses what seems like temporal scaling to reconstruct an image from a lower resolution, so you can render the game at a lower, more attainable resolution and reconstruct it on the full output resolution with surprisingly good effects. With render resolution down to 720 and the lowest settings, I got into the heaviest fight I have encountered in the game so far, and I was surprised when I noticed those worst moments will not dip under 34 FPS. The game remained playable at all times. The upscaling from 720p actually looks impressively good, but one cannot ask much visually from the lowest settings, which only have very basic baked-in shadows and reflections. Everything looks a bit like a console game from half a decade ago. Still, the gameplay is fantastic and preserved in all its glory, so this performance on a Vega iGPU is definitely a win. Let's upgrade this PC a bit and see what we can get. With a RAM upgrade to 16GB and a GTX 1050, this PC is now closer to what a lot of people will consider an entry-level gaming PC. What can we expect? If you're aiming for as close as 60fps P-Sync as you can, your best bet is to remain on 720p and use the extra space and access to proper VRAM to raise texture resolution, texture filtering, and shadow resolution. If better resolution is a must, you can increase render resolution to 1080p while remaining on lowest settings. In the case of 720p, the changes in texture and shadow settings honestly does not make much of a difference. Much of the magic of this game's graphics are in the reflections and lighting, which is so heavy that we cannot hope to enhance it on this GPU while keeping a 60fps lock. The game can still drop to 30fps lock on a number of very heavy battle scenes, but in general, it can maintain 60fps with acceptable stability. If you choose instead to keep everything on low and increase render resolution to 1080p, you will get something closer to 45fps average, but with the cleaner advantages of a high-resolution image. Although, again, do not expect any eye candy on lower settings. The game still feels fantastic to play. Let's upgrade the GPU and try again. We now change to a better GTX 1060. With the upgraded GPU power, if we stay at 720p render resolution, we can now easily hit the medium preset while still keeping the 60fps lock. Medium settings are where things get interesting, as we finally get to experience some of the sophisticated reflections of this game. Most levels are covered in reflecting materials, which are managed with a combination between screen space reflections and sign distant fields, which allows decent reflections of elements outside of screen space without the performance hit of full-blown ray tracing. However, the reflections on this game are still computationally heavy, and only at this level we can finally enable them at medium. This is the more drastic visual change, although having ambient occlusion and higher quality global illumination certainly help. Performance-wise, the GPU is perfectly able to keep the 60fps lock with no problem, even on the heaviest combat. If higher resolution is a must, you can increase render resolution to 1080 and drop all the settings and leave reflections at medium and still play at a somewhat stable 60fps, although experiencing P-Sync jumps on a couple of instances. The bump in resolution is nice, but the temporal scaling does such a great job that I would actually recommend sticking to 720 or similar, with the medium preset for what looks like an overall better experience. For most bigger games released this year, a GTX 1080 will be considered overkill for medium settings at 60 FPS, and yet seems appropriate for those settings in Control, which is a testament to how heavy some of the effects on this game can be. For medium settings and 1080p, the GTX 1080 can easily do the medium settings, even at the worst moments, with a little bit of space to spare. Raising any of the bigger settings, like reflections too high, will cause drops on those instances. For higher settings, you can again rely on the resolution scaling and drop to 720p and hit the higher settings with a lot of space to spare. The change is particularly noticeable, again, in the quality of the reflections, but a lot of the effects can be quite noisy due to the low resolution. So I will personally suggest sticking to medium settings on 1080p and increasing the texture quality just a bit further. In conclusion, Control is a GPU-intensive game that requires a very strong GPU for the higher settings, even if only on 1080p and aiming for 60 FPS. The extra power does not go to waste, as the game combines years of graphical techniques to create an impressive looking image, even before considering ray tracing. If you're using a modest GPU and all you care about is the gameplay, Control allows you to disable most of it, and the very generous temporal scaler allows you to render the game at a lower resolution while still looking quite decent. The game's story, exploration, and combat is excellent too, so even at the lowest settings, the game is sure to be a thrill.